What is the state of retirement in America for people that still have a runway to retire?
Most people, I think, don't even have this framework in their mind that this is even possible. I want to reach this number as early as possible. And what that does is open up the possibility of doing things that they actually want to do with their time.
But there's a silent killer out there for all of these plans, and that's inflation. The money supply is going up by 7%.
It might be 15% in education. It might be 26% in healthcare. Why would you sell the better asset first? You can apply an 8% withdrawal rate to Bitcoin. It sounds kind of crazy. Oh, you're going to sell down 8% of your Bitcoin every single year. But the math is the math.
Bitcoin changes the equation.
It's going to grow a lot faster than that.
If there is a 40-year-old watching this video right now, how much Bitcoin does he need to retire ASAP?
A 4-year-old to retire
40-year-old.
A
Yes.
40-year-old. I think the answer is always and everywhere 6.15 BTC, which is the number that I threw out there on stage on the panel that I was on. And it's a meme that goes back years that nobody laughed at, unfortunately, which I guess tells you how long I've been around Bitcoin and just how much the culture has changed. That's no longer a good meme, but I think it's a good meme. And it's actually not maybe that far off from the truth. It obviously depends on what you are trying to do with your goals in your life. And I always start this question with, okay, you need to tell me, how much do you spend? What kind of like timeline is it that you're working on? And what is your asset mix? Do you have other assets that you haven't pushed into Bitcoin? Because if you do, it's going to mean that you need a lower Bitcoin number, assuming that you're committed to that allocation, because you can give the Bitcoin a little bit more of a runway to accumulate value over time while you sell down those other assets first. And so, most people are not 100% allocated to Bitcoin. I'm not. I've got a very strong allocation to Bitcoin, but I have a portfolio of stocks that I've owned for years and years that I just never sold and moved into Bitcoin, despite wanting to do so. That's a whole different thread we could maybe pull on. But if you have a mixed portfolio, let's just keep it simple, of stocks and Bitcoin, two liquid assets that you can draw down in retirement or over a certain period of time, why would you sell the better asset first? You might as well structure your withdrawals in a way that gives the better asset more time to run and compound. And in order to do that, you would sell down the stocks first. So I read a lot about this in the newsletter. Withdrawal orders, how much Bitcoin do you need to retire? I've got a really cool tool out there, which we can get into what all the functionality is in that tool, that can help people to answer this question based on their inputs and their conception of what the Bitcoin price is going to do and what the inflation rate is going to be and all of these different variables. So the simple answer is 6.15 BTC, but the real answer is a little bit more complex than that.
Understood. So you have a newsletter, a relatively new YouTube channel where you talk about this all the time. Fire BTC, financial independence, retire early. It's been a phenomenon for the last 30 years. People have really dived into this movement, tried to figure out a way to earn as much as they can in their younger years so that they are free to do what they want later on. So let's start from the beginning and let's talk about the regular retirement math. In terms of retirement for millennials, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, what is a prescribed number that a financial institution like your old employer, Goldman Sachs, would tell to their clients?
Well, I'm not going to speak to Goldman Sachs. I'll tell you where I start. And that is this kind of age-old rule called the 4% rule. And it was built on a research effort back in the 90s called the Trinity Study. And what the study did was look at the historical performance of a 50-50 mix of stocks and bonds over about 130 year period, some very long period of time. And the question that it ultimately answered was, given that historical performance and expecting that historical performance to continue, what is a safe withdrawal rate for somebody to fund a retirement over a 30-year time horizon. So if you are in kind of the traditional way of approaching a career and then moving into retirement, you go to school, you graduate, you get a job, you work for 30 years or whatever, 40 years most of the time, you get to age 60 or 65, and then you stop working and you need to fund your lifestyle over another 30-year period before you die. And this approach, the ultimate conclusion was, if you have this 50-50 stock and bond portfolio and you assume this historical rate of return, which is about 10% for the S&P on average over long periods of time, the real rate after you factor in inflation is more like 7 to 8%. And bonds is obviously less than that. But what the conclusion of the study was is that for 95% of the historical back tests that they did, if you withdraw 4% of your portfolio from the time that you start retirement over a 30-year time horizon, you have enough money to cover your expenses as long as your portfolio is large enough where that 4% rule maps to your expenses. So this is why I said it all starts from what is your lifestyle and what are you spending your money on during that time period where you don't have any income, right? So we can kind of control for all of these different variables and make it very simple and say, when I retire, I've got some portfolio that I'm going to start drawing down from. If it is large enough where I can cover my expenses by withdrawing 4% per year perpetually, adjusted for inflation, then I've reached it. I've reached financial independence. I no longer need an income because I can I can replace that income with these drawdowns. I can create income by selling down my portfolio. And it just so happens to be conservative enough that it's going to last me at least 30 years. In most of those historical back tests, it actually lasted much longer than that, to the effect that you end up with way more than what you started with. There's only that small number of samples where if you start withdrawing at the exact wrong time, right before the 2008 financial crisis or right before the Great Depression starts or something like that, that you might risk running out of money. That also assumes that you're not actually flexible enough in your approach, that you don't have some type of reactive mechanism in your life to be able to adjust. It's just like a mechanical rule. Hey, I'm withdrawing 4% no matter what. I'm never going to pursue any other type of income. I'm never going to adjust this spending that I do in response to the market and the way that things are working. It's a simplified way to think about, what should I be going for? What should I be aiming at to reach a level where I can feel very confident that I am financially independent, that I can tell my boss who I don't like to go pound sand, that I can like cut that commute completely out of my life that's making you miserable and giving you road rage every single day. When you reach that number, you can feel very, very confident that the assets that you have built for yourself are going to be able to sustain you through that long time period. So that's the general overview of what the 4% rule aims to solve and is a great shorthand for. And Bitcoin introduces a very interesting dynamic in this, because our expectation, you and me and a lot of other people, is that it's going to grow a lot faster than that 10% per year that I quoted for the S&P 500. So we can talk about what that might imply, but that's the basic framework that I work from as a starting point for how much do you need to reach financial independence.
And so you put out some numbers in your work. You say 25x annual expenses is what you should go for, right? So if you're spending 100 grand a year, you want to have a nest egg of $2.5 million.
And that is
right?
The inverse of that 4% rule. So if you take your expenses and divide by 4%, it's the same as if you take those expenses and multiply by 25x. So maybe a little easier mental math for a lot of people is to just multiply by 25 times your expenses.
But the idea is, with the 4% rule, you would at 90, if you retired at 60 and lived until 90, you would still have a nest egg that big at the end of 2.5 million. That's the idea. Like you're not drawing it down to zero.
In most cases, obviously the market moves a lot over that time period. There's a lot of different variables that are at play that are impossible, absolutely impossible to predict. This is a conservative approach to ensure that you've got the best possible chance for having enough money to last you through that 30 year period. In some cases, you might die with zero because you've sold it all down. It's been like kind of poor long-term market returns. Maybe you started spending more than what you had planned for or something like that. In most of those historical cases, though, according to this Trinity study, you ended up with far more than what you actually needed. And that's because, if you do the quick, very simple math, there's about a 6% delta between what you're withdrawing from a nominal perspective versus what the S&P 500 is giving you in terms of historical returns. If your returns and your withdrawals are perfectly linear, then you've got an extra 6% every year that you're accumulating, essentially. That's not at all how the markets work, as we all know. But it is an interesting thought experiment to just say, this is the reason that a lot of people, even though they're withdrawing and selling down 4% of their portfolio every single year, they still end up far wealthier by the time that they are actually passing away and then passing that wealth on to their family.
So let's talk about the reality of the situation, though. 2.5 million is a great goal to have, but I think I heard you say that the average 401k is around 230,000, right? A tenth of that. So what is the state of retirement in America for people that still have a runway to retire, say in their 30s and 40s?
So this is where the retire early piece of FIRE actually comes into play, right? So we talked about financial independence and kind of how to define what that looks like, but we didn't cover the retire early piece of this. Before anybody kind of accuses me of thinking that everybody wants to retire and whatever, that's not the emphasis that I put on this. I do put the emphasis on financial independence. The early part is a very strong focus of mine, is that I want to reach this number and I want my readers to reach this number for themselves as early as possible. And what that does is open up the possibility of retirement, but also the possibility of working on passion projects, traveling the world, doing things that they actually want to do with their time instead of going and sitting in a cubicle from 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. So when we talk about financial independence, this retire early piece of FIRE is really like the goal of this movement is, how can I accelerate my timeline to hitting that financial independence number so that I'm opening up this optionality? The way that you need to do this, the way that you need to approach this, is to focus very intently on making sure that your expenses are as low as they can reasonably be, while still giving you the types of like focus and intentionality that you want in your life. I don't advocate for people to eat rice and beans and live in a cardboard box. Some people will choose to do that. There definitely are some people who are like way down on that spectrum. They take it extremely far on the expense side. But also over time, your income should grow. You develop new skills, there are new opportunities. And so what you're really focusing on for the time that you are working and pursuing something like this is to widen that gap between your income and your expenses as much as possible. And you take that savings and you push it into these liquid assets that can be used as your portfolio for funding your retirement. I'm a very strong advocate for Bitcoin. I think the stock market is a great place to do that as well, at least in the US. And so by doing that, you're building this engine that compounds over time. And if you focus very intently on doing that early in your career, earlier in life, or right now over the next 5 to 10 years, you can actually accelerate your path to financial independence much more than the people who you're referring to who have very little savings are actually able to do. And the reason I think they're not able to do that, and I don't want to hand wave away like economic hardship and these different types of things, but most people, I think, don't even have this framework in their mind that this is even possible. Most people are not necessarily financially literate from a personal finance standpoint, so that they would know that they need to focus very intently on their expenses, especially early on as they're trying to build some wealth. They're just not focused on putting together a framework or a plan for themselves that would allow for this. And that's why people end up with not a whole lot saved. Again, not trying to like downplay different hardships that people have, but I'm pretty optimistic guy. Like I think there's tons and tons of opportunity if you are aware that that opportunity exists and you have a little bit of focus and gumption to actually go out and achieve this path that is pretty available to almost everybody, I think.
And we're going to get into how Bitcoin changes the equation for retirement. But before we do that, there's a silent killer out there for all of these plans, and that's inflation, right? And it is stated at 2 to 3%, but in reality, the money supply is going up by 7%. And so we are seeing this inflation creep all over in every part of our lives, whether it's food or housing or education. How do you factor in the real rate of inflation compared to the government numbers, the CPI?
The real rate of inflation is different for everybody. Everybody has a different set of things that they spend money on, and therefore the basket of those goods and services that you spend money on, that I spend money on, that my neighbor spends money on is different. It's unique. And so you actually do have a lot of control over this. You have a spectrum of control over the things that you need to be funding for sure. But I think it's too easy of a shorthand to say the government's stating inflation is 3%, it's really 7%, or it's really 10%, or whatever. Well, it might be 15% in education, and it might be 26% in healthcare, but your Netflix subscription's not doing that. There's your car maybe is holding its value because you bought the right one. Like there's all kinds of different variables there. So I know where you're going with this, and I want to avoid oversimplifying it for the sake of trying to boil something down to a single number.
100%.
The other side of this, though, but sorry, before you keep going, the other side of this, though, is that the reason that we are stacking assets like stocks and Bitcoin is so that we can fund our lives in the future. Those assets benefit, in nominal terms at least, from this inflation that you're referring to. So when this new money comes into existence, when it's printed by the credit system of the banks and the Federal Reserve and the government deficits and all this kind of thing, that money has to go somewhere. And it does go into goods and services that pushes up the price and the production price of those things. It also goes into the assets that you're buying, that you're stacking over that time period when you're accumulating. And so you actually benefit from some of that money printing as long as you are actually putting that wind at your back instead of in your face.
So now let's bring in Bitcoin. A lot of people watching this use Bitcoin as their retirement plan. Well, you have the numbers, you've done all the spreadsheets, and you have some ways to progress out and look into the future and say, how much do you need to save? What can you withdraw? And how does Bitcoin change the whole equation?
So I think about Bitcoin's potential as one, asymmetric, that it can only go to zero, just like stocks can, but because of where it is in its adoption cycle and the fact that it's perfectly fixed in supply, it gives it an asymmetric upside that should produce, my expectation is that will produce a much larger growth rate than the stock market. To be very conservative, even though, over the past 8 years or something, it's been 50% per year on average or something like that. Right now, we're going through a period where if you look at the 5-year CAGR number, it's very small. It's still positive, but very small. But we need to zoom out and make sure that we're thinking about long enough time horizons where the actual economic and market cycles can play out over this. From a conservative standpoint, I tend to think about Bitcoin at a 25% CAGR over very long periods of time. If you drop that down even further to 20%, then and you compare that 20% to a 10% growth in the S&P, which implies a 4% withdrawal rate, then I think you can apply an 8% withdrawal rate to Bitcoin. So this actually, I think, is very conservative. It sounds kind of crazy. Oh, you're going to sell down 8% of your Bitcoin every single year. But the math is the math. Those calculations work regardless of what the underlying asset actually is. If Bitcoin does actually produce those types of gains, it can sustain a higher growth rate.
How many apps does it take to manage your Bitcoin? One to buy, one to send, one for Lightning, and another for loans. That's a lot of friction. Well, now there's Rhino. Listen to the end, and I'll tell you how they'll set you up with $10 of free Bitcoin. Rhino is a next-generation Bitcoin app that makes living on Bitcoin easy. At Rhino, you can buy Bitcoin with 0 fees. Get a Bitcoin-backed loan right in the app. Move cash globally over Bitcoin rails fast and easy. Automate your stacking with a DCA plan, so your stack is growing, whether the market is up, down, or you're touching grass. And it doesn't stop there. Bill pay, debit and credit cards, as well as retirement accounts are all coming soon. At Rhino, your Bitcoin is never rehypothecated. Security comes first, with biometric verification, 24/7 fraud protection, and the ability to move your Bitcoin to self-custody whenever you're ready. Click the link below in the description and download Rhino for iOS or Android. Use code Bitcoin News and Rhino will drop you $10 of free Bitcoin right into your wallet to start you on your stacking journey. Get the most Bitcoin for your dollar with Rhino.